Does the NBA have a tanking problem? Because we look at tanking much differently now than we used to. It's a common practice over the last couple of years, in sharp contrast to what it used to be back when the process Sixers were doing their thing and everybody was blaming them for just shamelessly losing games. And in contrast now, the Oklahoma City Thunder are seen as one of the brightest young teams in the league, one of the best organizations in the league, and they are clearly and actively trying to lose basketball games. Is this a problem? Are we viewing tanking differently now? Should it be something that the league should continue to look at? All those things, what we're going to be talking about in today's video. But quickly, before we get started, I like to remind people, leave a like rating on the video if you enjoy it. It helps get the video out to more people on YouTube. It really does help me out. You can consider subscribing as well. If you're new here, what's up? My name is Tucker. It's the most consistent NBA content on YouTube every single day. And if you want to hang out with me outside of these videos, there's a Linktree link down in the description below for that. Hang out with me outside of these videos. With those things said, let's talk about it. So tanking in general needs to be talked about here, and then we'll get to some of the other stuff. So it's been made pretty clear over the last couple of seasons in the NBA that one of the best ways, pretty much the only way, if you're a smaller market team specifically, to become a championship contending group is by drafting well. And speaking of the Thunder, you can go back and look at the Kevin Durant, the Russell Westbrook, James Harden era Thunder, right? That was clearly a smaller market team, and they became an incredible roster through the draft. Not necessarily by intentionally tanking, but they had a couple of top 5 draft picks on their roster. All of them panned out really well, and they made the finals as a result. Another example of this that isn't directly linked to tanking, but shows that the draft is pretty much the only way that a smaller market team can become a championship contender, is the Milwaukee Bucks. At the time that they drafted Giannis Antetokounmpo, they weren't really going anywhere. They didn't have much of a future, and there wasn't a real avenue for them to become a championship contending team that they've been over the last couple of seasons, despite some playoff failures. And the minute they drafted Giannis Antetokounmpo and then he continued to develop and became a back-to-back MVP, they became contenders, and that was a route that did not exist through free agency. It did not exist via a trade. The only way they would have gotten there is by drafting and developing a true superstar. That's exactly what happened with Giannis, and it shows that tanking is a proven strategy. It's a core part of the team building mechanics that are at play most prevalently in the NBA at the moment. And the reason for that is because it works. The way that the draft structure is set up in the NBA, the worst teams get the best players. And if you're a smaller market team, you're probably not going to get the best players in free agency. You're probably not going to get the best players via a trade. So the only way you can do that is by doing the draft tank process strategy that everybody has adopted. But it's interesting how this has developed over the last couple of years in the NBA, because when the process started in Philadelphia almost 10 years ago now, everybody was criticizing the Sixers and saying they were one of the worst organizations in the league. They were running a G League team. And ultimately, the success that they're having now is directly linked to that process era. And it was really tough for them to get through that, but they ended up with Ben Simmons. They ended up with Joel Embiid. The fit is certainly questionable between those two players, but the talent is not. And they acquired those two players via tanking. Yes, they made plenty of missteps along the way, but the fact that they had missteps and still have become the team that they have been, it just even further proves the point that tanking is a legitimate, viable strategy for smaller market teams, and arguably the only viable strategy for smaller market teams to become true championship contenders, right? But now as we fast forward to this season, the Oklahoma City Thunder are tanking about as shamelessly as you possibly can. Okay, they were a surprise team in the beginning of the year, just like they were at points last year with Chris Paul, and now this year with SGA, kind of leading things here, where they're winning more games than they should, and they kind of realized it, and they told Al Horford to go home. They're going to pay him, but they weren't going to play him. Like, he was not going to be on the floor, so they told him, might as well just, go home, do your own thing. And they've been losing a ton of games lately to position themselves well in this draft. And it's very clearly tanking. And for years and years and years, the league has been trying to find ways to prevent this, right? And they have not been successful to a large extent. I think there are some teams this year that typically would have been tanking that aren't, because of one of the measures they put in place to try and prevent teams from tanking, that being the play-in game, increasing your opportunity to get something of value out of your season towards the end of the year by getting into a play-in game, by getting into the playoffs, by getting that experience for your younger players. That value that some people see in that is easier to attain this year as a result of one of the things that they implemented to try and prevent teams from tanking, that being the play-in game, right? And then also, they changed up the lottery odds. And I think at certain points that has helped, some teams kind of go away from this tanking model, because you can be, have the 8th, 9th best odds to win the lottery and still end up winning it. Just ask the Pelicans, ask the Grizzlies, who got the second overall pick despite not great odds, right? So the league is continually trying to push back on this, but why do we think so much differently about tanking now? Why do we perceive the Thunder as a team that is intelligent and is organized and has everything together, whereas when Philadelphia was doing basically the same thing, it wasn't perceived that way? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that, which is very obvious, we're just more used to it. Tanking as aggressively as Philadelphia did was a truly new concept. Not that teams hadn't lost games on purpose in the past, but to do it so publicly and to have that be the stated goal of your season, to not win games, was something that was very new. And now we're more accustomed to it. And upwards of 8, 9, 10 teams in a given season are tanking by the end of the year in the NBA. It's something that we have grown accustomed to. Also, this was something that the Oklahoma City Thunder were kind of forced into, right? There was pretty much no indication that they were going to move Russell Westbrook or move Paul George prior to Paul George being traded to LA because of the crazy offer they got from the Clippers and him wanting to go to LA and play with Kawhi. Before that situation developed, the Thunder had no intentions of tanking. They were going to continue to try and push to be a postseason team with those two guys and try and continue to be as much of a threat as they possibly could. And so they kind of just backed into this whole tanking thing where they got a ton of stuff for Paul George. They got a ton of stuff for Russell Westbrook. SGA has developed into a really good foundational piece of a rebuild. And they went from Russell Westbrook and Paul George to SGA and Lou Dort, sure, just like the Sixers went from Drew Holiday to Nerlens Noel. But it wasn't a choice that they really wanted to make. It's almost one that they had to make. And I think people respect that they've been able to pivot so quickly and so well, and they respect the future that this team now has with the young players and the picks, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that at its core, it's not the exact same thing. They're not trying to win games. It's still tanking, and for a lot of people, that is a significant issue. Now, for me, ultimately, there's two things here. One, it's going to be incredibly difficult for the league to ever get rid of tanking in the NBA with the way things are currently structured. They can change the odds. They can add the play-in game. But until there is a more viable option for smaller market teams to create championship contenders than getting the best draft lottery odds possible, tanking is going to be a thing. Tanking is here to stay. It's not going anywhere, okay? There's just quite simply isn't a better option, right? And then the other aspect of this is I'm not sure it's a bad thing. I'm not sure it's a bad thing that you're creating really good young teams in these smaller markets. And granted, it's not great for a couple of years, and the tanking thing doesn't always work out, right? Just ask Chicago. They might not make the playoffs this year after tanking and making moves and things like that. It might not always work out, but I'm not necessarily sure it's a bad thing that teams are trying to acquire and accumulate young talent to potentially create an Oklahoma City-like situation. And again, ultimately, if that's their only choice, that's what they're going to do. These teams are tasked with creating the best NBA team that they can, and ultimately this is still their best option. Now, overall, for the product of the league, especially in the exact time period that we're in right now, towards the end of the regular season, tanking has certainly had a negative effect on the overall product of the NBA at this point in the year, where there's a lot of time where you turn on a game and there's a G League roster out there for a team, you know what I mean? And they're trying to develop their younger guys, and they're trying to, accumulate assets and develop these players into real assets, right? And that certainly has a negative impact on the back end product. But once you get to the postseason, there's a lot of teams that are, it's top half of the conference that got there by tanking, that got there by acquiring a really, really good player at the top of the draft that wouldn't have been able to do that in free agency, wouldn't have been able to do that via a trade. And ultimately, I really don't think it's a problem. I know that conceptually it seems odd that teams would be losing on purpose, and that can inflate different records, and that can create, maybe not a great product at certain points in the regular season. But I don't know what the solution is. I don't know how you fix that. And so ultimately, if something doesn't have a solution, is it really still a problem, right? And ultimately, it's not like these teams lose forever. There are certainly franchises that do lose forever, right? And they never seem to turn it around for 15 to 20 years. But I'd argue that would be the case with or without tanking. Minnesota, Sacramento, these are teams and franchises that consistently, no matter what team building strategy they implement, can't seem to figure it out under whatever ownership or under whatever general manager. That's not a tanking thing. That's just those franchises being who they are. And ultimately, if tanking is a means to an end, right, of a team acquiring young talent, potentially creating a championship contender on the level of the Bucks after they acquire Giannis, or on the level of those Oklahoma City Thunder teams with Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and James Harden, then ultimately I feel like that's a positive thing. And we've all kind of come to the understanding that this is part of it, so fans are more willing to sit through 3 years of losing if they could potentially get Cade Cunningham and SGA on their roster. You know what I mean? I don't necessarily think, at least for the younger fan base, I don't necessarily think that they see it as a bad thing. I think some people, some fans, would advocate for their teams to potentially rebuild, to potentially tank, and they won't do it. I think there are some Pacers fans out there that would really, really like for this team to tank and kind of reset things rather than continually be between the 5th and the 9th seed every single year in the Eastern Conference. I think there are fans out there that would rather their teams tank more, right? And there's always going to be, different ends of the spectrum, and some people want more tanking or less tanking, but ultimately, for it to truly be a problem, I think it needs to be breaking down the foundations, of what makes the NBA great. And for me, what makes the NBA great is the entertainment value it provides, the drama that it provides on the basketball court as well as off, and the different ways that you can kind of maneuver and think about with yourself how to build a team and where a team is going to go from here, who's positioning themselves for the next big star trade, who's going to make the correct moves in the draft. Team building and roster building from a fan perspective is arguably just as big a part of the NBA fan experience as watching the games. And tanking is a huge, huge part of that. And ultimately, I don't see how that can be a bad thing when it's driving interest, okay? When it's creating possible really, really good teams. And as I continue to say, it's still the most viable option if you're a smaller market team to create a championship contender. Let me know down in the comment section below what you guys think. If you feel like this is an issue, if you love tanking, if you hate tanking, if you feel like it's kind of weird how differently we perceive it now than we did back then, let me know down in the comment section below. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you guys very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, you can check out the boxes on screen. Leave a like rating on the video as well. Again, if you enjoyed it, try to get out to more people on YouTube, and you can hang out with me at various socials and a link down in the description below as well. With all those things said, hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you all next time.